Good evening and welcome. This is a recorded session forming part of the first of the conversational talks on the theme of faith in the public square, being organized by the Diocese of New York. And this evening we're going to be talking about the role of exile and refuge and travel in the shaping of the spirituality of the Church of England tradition, which is at the root of the Anglican and Episcopal tradition, and in particular, the role that international contacts of various kinds played in the forming of the Book of Common Prayer, which is obviously the key document in our identity as an Episcopal Church. Now, I am very, very delighted indeed to say that the conversation partners whom I invited to take part this evening both agreed very, very readily, and I'm enormously grateful to them both. We have my very good friend over many, many years, Professor Diarmaid MacCulloch from the University of Oxford. To list his books would take more time than we have, but let's just say that some years back, Diarmaid published what is still, I think, the definitive biography of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and more recently also a biography of Thomas Cromwell, as well as major works which cover the story of the Reformation, both the later Reformation in England, the story of the Reformation under King Edward, and the whole story of the European Reformation. And as well, of course, as a major single-volume history of Christianity. He has just published a work entitled Lower Than the Angels, a history of sex and Christianity, which is both timely and based on many, many years of thoughtful study. Our other conversation partner, I'm equally delighted to welcome, and we've known each other intermittently for some time, is Professor Polly Ha of Duke Divinity School, whom I first met through a conference which she helped to organize, which became an edited volume entitled The Reception of Continental Reformation in Britain, organized along with the late, great, and much loved doyen of late Tudor and 17th century church history, Patrick Collinson. Polly has also published a volume on English Presbyterianism and recently a scholarly edition of a historic text under the title Reformed Government, Puritanism, Historical Contingency, and Ecclesiastical Politics. My name is Euan Cameron, and I am a priest ordained in the Diocese of New York and now serving in the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. For 20 years, I taught the history of the Reformation and church history more generally in Union Theological Seminary in New York, and I published a book or two on the subject down the years. So we'll launch straight into this conversation. We will, broadly speaking, follow the story of the Reformation in the English context and in the English language lands, beginning from the beginning of the 16th century, the beginning of the 1500s, continually circling back to the role that travel and exchange and the receiving and being received as travelers and refugees played in our story. So, if I may, Diarmaid, can I invite you to set the scene for us at the beginning of the story of the Reformation?
Thank you, Euan. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. We need to think what England was at the beginning of all this process, at the beginning of the 16th century. It was a marginal island in the great continent of Europe. It wasn't really a major player, though its monarch for most of that time, King Henry VIII, thought of himself as a big boy. He wasn't one of the big boys. He wasn't like the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, or the King of Poland. But all through the story of the early Reformation, his wish to impose himself on Europe was really part of the story. So here's a marginal place. It is an island on the edge of what became the Reformation. And therefore, it took its cues from the Reformations elsewhere, the Reformations in Germany, the Reformations in Switzerland, and therefore travel was really important in this story. Travel, often involuntary travel, you might say, exile, refuge, finding a place where you were safe. And that began in England very soon after Martin Luther created his Reformation in Germany. I'll lay down one other bit of basic information we need to chuck into this story. First, we're not talking about Anglicanism in the 16th century. That's a much later term describing something which evolved from this story. We're talking about Protestantism of two major sorts, one of which was that of Martin Luther, up in the little university town of Wittenberg in northern Germany, but another Reformation in Central Europe, in Switzerland, in southern Germany, which you might just call not Lutheran, but that's not a very positive name, and one name which was used at the time and still is used in such parts of Protestantism is Reformed with a capital R. Some of that Reformed Protestantism is often called Calvinism, but I think we keep the word Reformed. So keep those two things in mind. Lutheranism, Reformed Protestantism. Where would England fit in this? To begin with, clearly it wouldn't know. Martin Luther had just done something remarkable, 1517 onwards, in standing up against the papacy, and England gradually was affected by that. And one man in particular stands out as the first exile important in our story, William Tyndale, an Englishman determined to create an English Bible. But he could only do it outside England. With its determined traditional regime in church and commonwealth. He could only do it in Europe, mainland Europe, that is, principally in Antwerp. He was influenced by Martin Luther, but struck out in many ways on his own. So we need to name check William Tyndale, and we need to see what he did, which was to begin the process of creating the English Bible in all its various 16th and 17th century forms, which is the basis of all English-speaking Protestantism. So I lay on the table for you William Tyndale to start with.
Yep. And he has to move around quite a bit. Really, I mean, it's a very unsafe time, even in Germany, isn't it?
Oh, well, absolutely so, because the Holy Roman Emperor, who was not just Holy Roman Emperor, but the chief political figure in the Low Countries, was extremely hostile to what was happening. So Tyndale wasn't entirely safe at all in his exile. Probably safer than he would be in England, but in the end, as it tragically proved, he was executed by the Emperor Charles V, in 1536.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting how we see with Tyndale, him being joined by a number of other English exiles. You get all of the Johns, John Bale, John Hooper, John Rogers, and their movement also shaping his continued revision of his translations. We think about him picking up Hebrew, 7 languages, just in such an astonishingly gifted way. But I think the revisions of his translation are testament to the continued revisions that are going on real time in a dynamic way. And so I think that the debates between Luther and some of the Reformed interjecting into the English experience as they're listening to those debates between Zwingli and Luther, and they're there present on the scene.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I'll throw in two more crucial figures. Well, I've mentioned Henry VIII already as the difficulty in the situation, but let's name Thomas Cranmer, whom Henry VIII chose as his archbishop, really simply to have a compliant clergyman to get him his first marriage annulled. But Cranmer had his own agenda, and it turned out to be resonating with Reformation in mainland Europe. I'll also name the other person of whom I've written a biography, Thomas Cromwell. chief minister through most of the 1530s to the king, often seen as a cool, secular, cynical figure, but no, a man absolutely committed to Protestant Reformation and exploring what that might mean for England. So we've got Cranmer and Cromwell pushing their own agendas while serving the king. It's a very complicated situation. And I would maintain that both Cranmer and Cromwell, who are, of course, sitting in England through the 1530s, are the people chiefly in touch with these various reformers in exile that Polly has mentioned, and I've mentioned William Tyndale, using their thought and also deciding what that meant for the direction of the Reformation, which they could add to Henry VIII's own plans. And spoiler alert, the end of the story is to the Reformed side of the Protestant Reformation, not to the Lutheran side. Cromwell, in particular, was extremely important in directing England's religious energies towards a city which had never really had any contact with England at all. It is the Swiss city of Zurich. And Cromwell was the man who set up contacts between Zurich and England in the 1530s.
Yes. Of course, we think of Cranmer and Cromwell chiefly in terms of their work in England, but they both travelled quite a bit before their careers really took off, hadn't they? They'd built a lot of those overseas connections.
Yes, Cromwell in particular, he absolutely extraordinary, cultured, cosmopolitan man. I think that's why the English nobility hated him so much. They saw he had much more experience of life than they did. And in particular, in Italy,
Mhm.
he was the best Italian in Tudor England, having gone to Italy when he was a teenager and mysteriously acquired an education there. So he's got all sorts of contacts all through Europe, from Southern Europe through into the Low Countries, where he'd been a merchant in the years before William Tyndale got there. So that he is a sort of spider in the middle of our web. But Cranmer also, a man who in his travels as an ambassador for King Henry VIII, acquired a wife in Germany, in the city of Nuremberg. And her uncle was the chief theologian pushing forward the Lutheran Reformation in Nuremberg, though he turned out to be a bit of a maverick. So, yes, these two people have an extraordinary cosmopolitan gift to give insular little England on the side in its
Mhm.
Reformation.
Yeah.
I
Taking
think
us.
about when you spoke, Dermot, about just the story of England, it made me think of the whole of English history really being one of constant migration, where we have it's a story of amalgamation of these different traditions. And I think the same is true of what you just mentioned about how we tend to draw these broad contours of Christian humanism through Erasmus's visit to Cambridge and yet, here we have this Italian Renaissance thought that is often underplayed, the Machiavellian politics that they're in touch with in Italy. And there's so much to the story that gets kind of redacted out through the broad sweeping narratives that I think is wonderful to see through the careers of these politicians who are traveling to many different spots in all over the continent.
Yeah. One of the critical things that comes out of what we've already been discussing is that, as it turns out, once obviously the Reformation in England follows a rather complicated and winding course, but it does end up being, as you mentioned, Dermot, it ends up being reformed. But that's not without some, as it were, preliminary flirtations, not with Martin Luther, because he and Henry VIII had a warm mutual detestation of long
Hmm.
standing, but Lutheranism is a possibility in England. And why do we feel that doesn't work out?
Well, I think another exile needs to be thrown in, or what you might call a part-time exile. His name was Robert Barnes.
Mhm.
He'd been a leading Austin friar, Augustinian friar in the 1520s, fled at the end of the 1520s into Europe, and in particular to Wittenberg. And Barnes really knew what Luther was doing and was very enthusiastic for him. And so he's a presence in all this through the 1530s, sometimes in England, sometimes in Germany, sometimes being an ambassador for King Henry, sometimes being an ambassador to England for German princes. He's a very kaleidoscopic figure
Mm.
who clearly a major personality, but in 1540, when King Henry had a violent revulsion against the Reformation and in his violent anger killed his great chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, Barnes was also a victim. He was burned at the stake with great spite by Henry VIII for being a heretic, and there was no longer a great voice for Lutheranism in England from 1540. My former student, who all of us here know, Alec Ryrie, has called this the strange death of Lutheran England. And from then on, the stage was sort of cleared for reformed Protestantism to encounter Archbishop Cranmer still hanging on in there under Henry VIII and pulling the future of the Reformation forward into the next reign of Henry VIII's son.
Yeah.
Oh, I will. I can add to this that there's a sense in which, as we I think of the story fast forwarding to Cranmer's later career, this attempt to mediate between these traditions, the Lutheran and Reformed, continues to be an aspiration, and there's a long-standing reception of Luther's works across the 16th century into the 17th century that get funneled back and actually inject, a pietism later on into Central Europe. So there's a sense in which this kind of engagement early on with Tyndale and others on the continent continues back in England as they continue to think of themselves almost as this mediating partner.
I came across an interesting example of that, as it were, afterlife of Lutheranism in England when I was looking at the paraphrases of Erasmus, which were published in 1548, I think, in English.
In English,
And
yeah.
in the paraphrase of Romans, you have a prelude to Romans, and it's actually a very much reworked version of Luther's preface to Romans from his 1522 German Bible.
Mhm.
Unacknowledged,
Mm.
uncredited, but there it is. There is at the same time, let me just sort of indulge me to narrate for a moment. There's something that goes on in the continent, which is an unexpected collision of factors, which brings the continental Reformed tradition into the sight of the English policymakers and Cranmer in particular. In 1546, Luther dies. In 1547, Henry VIII dies, being succeeded, of course, by his very much underage son, Edward VI, under the tutelage of the Seymour dynasty at that time. And also in 1547, there is a campaign by the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, to try to take control of the religious situation in Germany by force. He defeats the Protestant League of Schmalkalden, I think we can call it Protestant by this stage, in battle at Mühlberg, and essentially takes control of Luther's Saxony. There's a story that Charles had a moment as it were, of generosity to the dead, and was asked, did he want to, if, as it were, to tear Luther out of his tomb? And he said, no, let's not do that. But the result is that Charles has control over the religious situation in Germany. And what ends up happening is that since it's impossible to suppress Lutheranism, Lutheranism becomes the officially endorsed religion in the empire alongside Roman Catholicism. This is eventually sort of formalized in 1555. Meanwhile, a lot of Reformed theologians who were not in the Swiss Confederation, but were in southern and western Germany, cities like Strasbourg and the rest of the towns of Swabia, they're all losing their jobs. Steadily, their situation becomes more and more uncomfortable. And into this scene comes Thomas Cranmer with some
Yeah,
invitation.
extraordinary, and this is a big turnaround in England at the same. So many times, as you've outlined, so many things are turning round in 1546-7, and the accession of young Edward, only 10 years old, he was being led by politicians who turned out to be very much committed to the Reformation, and suddenly, therefore, England was the largest surviving Protestant polity in all Europe. And it was a refuge, a haven for some of the biggest names in the earliest Reformation. You've mentioned Strasbourg. Well, the chief pastor of Strasbourg came, Martin Butzer. We could also point to an Italian Protestant, Peter Martyr Vermigli, who had been one of the stars of the early Catholic Reformation, now turned Protestant. So these are really important people that Cranmer has around him. And Cranmer had actually been in touch by letter with Martin Butzer since 1531. So this is a real gift to Cranmer. He can talk to these reformers from all over Europe. Another name we could throw in is a Polish Protestant, an aristocratic bishop who had left the Roman Catholic Church and become a chief pastor in Germany, Johannes Alasko, Jan Lwoski. So these are really important people in conversation at a crucial moment of the English Reformation, which gave us the first two versions of the English Book of Common Prayer, the ancestor of the Episcopal prayer book.
I think that, the way you've written about this, Dermot, as something that Cranmer's actively recruiting. He wants his dream team. And if he wants to see England as sort of flagship of Protestantism that can bridge these divisions and bring some solidarity, and he has the star ecumenical figure, Butzer, coming to England, he's got a winning team. And this idea that he's in prime recruiting season where England is able to host these academic stars and lights and reformers it shows the role of the universities. It shows the role of learning in bringing these conversations together in a way that Cranmer really believes can bridge these divisions.
Conversation's a very interesting word, Polly, because we have to remember, and our audience needs to remember, but not something apparently obvious. How could they communicate? Well, they all spoke Latin to each other. It is a university world in that sense. They are fluent in Latin. There could not have been a Reformation without Latin. Of course, the other thing to say is that the team is skewed, this dream team. It is all reformed, even Butzer. And the real litmus test is what you think goes on in the Eucharist, the service of Holy Communion. Are you creating the body and blood of Christ on a table? Or are you investing in a symbol, a very powerful symbol in which bread and wine stand for the body and blood of Christ? Now, Luther would say, just as the Pope would say, this is the body and blood of Christ. The Reformed won't say that. They will begin any sort of sentence about the Eucharist. Well, it depends what you mean by presence,
Well,
Christ's presence. And its symbol, which is important for them, even for Butzer, who actually just couldn't stop talking. And within this welter of words, you still see a reformed view of the Eucharist.
and you see Cranmer's evolution of his Eucharistic theology through that conversation.
Sure.
His starting point and his ending point through that time it evolves.
Yeah, sure. Lutheran, more or less, under Henry VIII, but a subtle change, 46-7, towards the Reformed position. That's a real shift. And that's the mood in which he was creating the books of common prayer.
That
And I
brings
love
us,
that this is the sort of layered conversation. I mean, we spoke about kind of amalgamation. I tend to think about it being helpful to see it as a sort of layered composition. We're probably going to turn to the Book of Common Prayer and its composition soon. And when I think about Cranmer's looking at some of the sources that these reformers are bringing with him, right? The crucial Chrysostom manuscript that he sees that helps him to evolve in his thinking about the Eucharist. To me, it's an interesting moment when you don't just simply have this contemporary debate, but you have a whole dialogue with church history. You have a composite of so many layers, not just of the medieval, but also of the early church, all part of that discussion as they're composing and revising these liturgical traditions.
I wonder if I can be devil's advocate here a little bit. Um, there are those who have been raised on a very, as it were, nationalistic story of the Book of Common Prayer, that it is heavily based on taking some of the most poetic and most appropriate passages from the Sarum Rite, which of course is really four books: the Missal, the Breviary, the Manual, and the Pontifical. And you can see Cranmer translating from some of those texts if you compare the medieval liturgy. And of course, the other thing that is sometimes claimed is that the Church of England is distinctive in forming a liturgy out of its pre-Reformation traditions. I wonder if we can just sort of challenge or some of those points and look at how the Book of Common Prayer comes into being in both its 1549 version and its 1552 version, because there are these two key editions that appear in the reign of Edward.
Yes, well, the story, as you delicately hinted, is one of wishful thinking on the part of Anglican historians. It is not unique in Europe. The Church of Sweden has a rather similar evolution of a liturgy, which actually did end up Lutheran. But England's didn't. 1549 was already imbued by Cranmer's skepticism about the real presence. Then it was revised in conversation with refugees such as Butzer, Martyr, Waski, towards a new edition, 1552, which broadly speaking, it was the prayer book which marched on to be the 1662 book, the definitive version of the English Rite. And there's one crucial thing about the Holy Communion service in the 1552 version of what Cranmer did, and it's what you do with bread and wine left over after the communion service has taken place. There will probably always will be some bread and wine left over. And this stage direction is technically called a rubric at the end of the service. It says, well, the curate shall have it to his own use, which means that he can take it home for his tea, for his supper. Now, you don't do that to the body and blood of Christ. You do it to bread and wine which have had a use in the service but no longer have a use. Now, that's crucial. It shows that the Book of Common Prayer and the form created at the end of the reign of Edward VI, still the Rite of 1662, was conceived of in a reformed mode and not in a Lutheran mode, let alone a traditionalist Catholic mode.
And we can also talk about the physical arrangement of churches. This is something that I know students of liturgy and ordinands are trained about, that what is sometimes said is that the 1552 book places the communion table arranged east and west, as it were, lengthways along the church. Sometimes it's in the chancel, but sometimes it's not even within the sacred priest's space, is it?
No, they couldn't decide. And I don't think the decision was properly made under Edward. It was under Elizabeth. One of the likely outcomes of Edward's regimes, where you used the church in two halves. You have the people's half, the nave, technically, in which morning and evening prayer were said, Sunday by Sunday. And then increasingly infrequently, the other half of the church, the chancel, was in use for communion services, separated by a screen, the remains of the medieval rood screen, now called a partition. And that remained the way that churches were used in England really through to the 18th century. And it's a way of using all the medieval fabric, but in two very contrasting ways, one for morning and evening prayer, the other for Holy Communions, probably by the end of Elizabeth's reign, Queen Elizabeth's reign, no more than 2 or 3 times a year.
Mm.
I'm thinking about how the ambiguities that we've sort of hinted at in the ways that Cranmer is masterful in being politique and diplomatic. And as I think about how the the Church of England at this state is kind of ingenious in a lot of ways in these kind of ambiguities, and we'll see this further on in Elizabeth's reign. I don't want to leap there quite yet, but I suppose that leaves it open to discontent and people wanting to clarify certain positions, and we'll see that later on in the story when people feel that it isn't sufficiently reformed.
Mhm.
And they want to continue it to continue to reform the Book of Common Prayer. And I think a lot of this hinges on what were Edward's intentions. Were they
Mhm.
finished in 1552 or were they going to keep going? And that open question that Dermot, just I love that final chapter in his book, The Boy King, is he talks about how the Elizabethan um, discontents are really arguing about what were Edward's intentions. And
Mm,
had he lived longer, what would he have liked to see? And that is the question that I think continues to remain open for debate, and I think gives a lot of insight into the question of worship that does make England stand out because it remains unsettled for over a century and longer in a way that just does not happen in the same way on the continent. And it's precisely this resolved question that gives the kind of ecclesiological depth and richness to the traditions in England as they develop. Confessional constructions, a lot that people later down the line will say makes England distinctive. And that their Reformation is uniquely positioned in a way by the 17th century to answer questions in a way that their counterparts are not. So they start to take it as a badge of distinction, the fact that they have not, or that they've continued on speaking about these questions on a level that is unparalleled.
Mm. I
mm,
wonder if I can follow on from what you've just been saying, Polly, a little bit to talk about what happens after Edward VI's reign. Because, of
mm,
course, Edward dies tragically young in 1553, and some of the leaders of the English Reformation elect to stay in the country, most famously Cranmer, but also Latimer, Hooper, Nicholas Ridley, and a number of those who are not bishops, and uh, a number of those leaders of the church, and also ordinary laymen and women, choose not to surrender their faith, but actually are executed as heretics under Mary. But we know of about 800 households that go to the continent, and those include quite a number of the leaders of the church as it will take shape under Elizabeth I after her accession in 1558. There's a famous dispute over the Book of Common Prayer and over the liturgy that takes place in one of the exile churches, which is in Frankfurt in central Western Germany. There's a rather interesting irony here. Back in the reign of Edward, there was an exile community of people who had come over from the Netherlands, which was looked after by a French-speaking Reformed pastor called Valéran Poulain. Now, Poulain leaves under Mary and finds himself in Frankfurt ministering to the French-speaking congregation of Reformed in Frankfurt. And then the English turn up, first of all, a group of English, including the Scotsman John Knox, and they ask permission to form a congregation, and they share the French exiles' church. And they're told, this is okay as long as you're French Reformed. And they say, well, okay. Then another group of exiles arrive, uh, traditionally supposed to be associated with the future Bishop of Ely, Richard Cox. And they start to reintegrate into the worship of the English exiles bits of the Book of Common Prayer which were regarded by the exiles as inappropriate. There's a bit of a debate over whether you should have responses, versicles and responses in the liturgy. There's a debate over certain things which had always been a little bit doubtful in relation to rings in marriage, cross in baptism, even the vestments of the clergy. That's going to be a big debate under Elizabeth. Now, the intriguing thing is, Richard Cox and some of his friends, Thomas Lever, Thomas Beacon, a number of people who had worked with Cranmer, who had gone abroad, and who would later play major roles in Elizabeth's church, they do something really rather unpleasant. And they warn the magistrates of Frankfurt that John Knox has written some very rude things about the Holy Roman Emperor and Mary and her husband Philip. And so they get Knox kicked out. But what's intriguing is that we have a liturgy which is believed to have been the work of Cox and his friends after they had Knox out of the way, after they got these super radical, reformed Genevan style worshippers out of the way. And even that is considerably moved on from the 1552 Book of Common Prayer. It leaves out a lot of the contentious things, still has the versicles and responses, but a lot of the other stuff is gone. So we can reasonably infer that when these Frankfurt folk come back to England under Elizabeth, they're thinking, oh, let's continue the job. Let's continue the work
Absolutely.
of Reformation.
I think
That's
the
crucial. Mm.
Yeah, no, I think the idea that the context of how one is situating the Book of Common Prayer in exile changes. The coordinates
Mhm.
change. You see this again in the mid 17th century, where people like John Cousin and others who want to emphasize certain things in the face of what they see as excessively zealous Protestantism, moderate themselves when they go to the continent. And I think the same happens here in Frankfurt, where you have a different context. They're desperately trying to mediate and find a compromise. And the idea that Cox is able to knocks out and Knox is goes to Geneva, is that a victory, or does it actually in some ways show that, had they reached some kind of agreement,
Mm.
then you wouldn't have had the kind of radicalization go that where a huge number ended up in Geneva that otherwise would have been in Frankfurt and had a more moderate vision. And I think the story there with Knox going, we all know what happens in Geneva is that Knox and Christopher Goodman are going to publish very radical resistance treatises, which alongside a new form of a book of common prayer, which is going to connect liturgical reform with political sedition in a very direct, explicit way. That will actually, in some ways, move this question forward in terms of how one thinks about the liturgical reform in relationship to supremacy. So, in some ways, there's kind of mixed results that fall out of this inability to reach a settlement in Frankfurt.
This period really of exile is really crucial to our story. Here are English people in exile debating amongst themselves about a possible future if Queen Mary died. They don't know she's going to die very soon. She, in fact, did. And so they're all able to come back into their next reign, that of Queen Elizabeth, having had these really quite poisonous arguments. And we must remember that all these arguments are between Reformed Protestants. We can forget Lutheranism from now on,
Mhm.
except that the authorities in Frankfurt were Lutherans and they'd been rather kind in allowing hospitality to any of these Reformed characters. But now the future in England and the church in England is going to be a future which is an argument, a conversation among Reformed Protestants.
Absolutely. And
And yet, at the same time, there is a sense in which the excesses of Reformed is clearly there in Elizabeth's mind. She is put off by what happened in Geneva because
Mhm.
she's been, female monarchy has been attacked in explicit terms
Yeah.
through the first blast that Knox publishes. And so there's a sense in which you have this Reformed culture that is not sitting entirely well with the Queen because of
Mm.
the political implications. And so there's a sense in which it's going to have a different character.
Yeah.
Once more, we ought to name Zurich. We've not mentioned the fact
Mhm.
that some of these English exiles from Mary went to Zurich, and it was the happiest and most harmonious. of all the exile experiences. And many of those who came back from Zurich into England in 1559 went on to be bishops.
Mhm.
So from now on, you can say there is a sort of establishment or Zurich version of Reformed Protestantism around which the Church of England was created.
Mhm.
It continued with Edward's Book of Common Prayer, more or less unaltered, but around that bishops increasingly behaved as if they were the head of the church in Zurich,
Mm.
within the terms which Elizabeth set them.
And interestingly, of course, the Zurich church was, people argue about how true this is, how extreme it is, but Zurich was one place where you don't get a lot of conflict between church and city. They seem to
Mm.
manage to get along. So Bullinger shows, Bullinger, the leader of the church at Zurich, shows that you can have quite radical Reformed theology, but maybe without the subversive tones which Polly has quite rightly drawn attention to in the wake of Geneva. And of course,
Yeah,
This is why Bullinger becomes the empire when they, in Elizabeth's reign, start to fight over the vestments. He is
mhm,
umpiring that debate.
yep.
yes, and it's acceptable to Elizabeth, who sent him a communion cup, which is still there in the city of Zurich. It's a rare thing for Elizabeth to give expensive presents to anybody, let alone a reformed theologian. So she clearly thought, okay, Zurich's all right. It's a sort of a model for the church I would set up in England.
And of course, key texts by the Zurich reformers end up being translated into English and published
Mm.
with the church's sanction. I wonder, we're almost coming to the end of our time. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the New World, because there is also a story there to be told of refuge and travel and changing contexts. Polly, do you want to sum
Sure.
up on
So
that?
we've been talking about how there are these different experiences that come back to Elizabeth's reign, where you have exiles who are coming from abroad, coming to the Elizabethan Church, who are contesting the question, certain elements in the Book of Common Prayer. And that is fine until John Whitgift is Archbishop, and in 1583 poses three articles, the second of which will really force the matter to come to a head because the clerics are need to subscribe to the idea that there's nothing contrary to Scripture in the Book of Common Prayer, and that is where you see this case of conscience conflicting many of those who do believe there are elements that are not there in Scripture, or even contradictory. And we have a number of those who want for the reform, like Thomas Cartwright, Walter Travers, going abroad, really coinciding in the 1570s, even before Whitgift. And the problem is that there's a shift now because there are religious wars. You have the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where all of these Protestants are being slaughtered, and that shifts the sense of urgency to identify with the Reformed cause and Calvinists who are under assault on the continent. And that therefore it's no coincidence that in 1572, with the wake of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, that you have Puritans launching a very virulent attack called the Admonition to Parliament on the English liturgy, arguing that the dial needs to move further. And this is where you get some of the most colorful language, calling it, all sorts of things as remnants from the Catholic tradition. And it's there that we get these open public debates about liturgical reform that will continue on. And some of this is framed again, of course, on the continent because these Puritan dissenters still see themselves as part of the Church of England. They
Right.
do not see themselves as separating. And in fact, you have a number of Cartwright and even Henry Jacob arguing against those who have called the Church of England altogether false over the liturgy. And they have basically argued that the third identifying mark of the church, not just the sacraments and the preaching of the word, but now church discipline are a third mark of the true church. And because the Church of England doesn't have it, it's a false church. And so these separatists who reject the church altogether are being denounced by fellow Puritans who are disagreeing with them on that point. The interesting thing here is that someone like Henry Jacob, who is attacking separatists Francis Johnson in the 1590s. Under King James I, when Elizabeth breathes her last, and King James I from Scotland comes to the English throne, um, their hopes are high because he was a master at thinking that giving everyone these hopes that he was going to either give more leniency or allow for there to be further revisions to the Book of Common Prayer. He allows a new translation, but in fact, alongside some of these concessions, which are very minor and not really addressing the key issues, like the ring in marriage and the cross in baptism, he enforces a greater conformity in his new canons. And this is what's going to lead a new form that is incredibly novel, which is the idea that the Church of England is not a national church. It is simply a composite of individual parishes. And so these Congregationalists who have this crisis of conscience believe that they are no longer separating, but they can worship according to their conscience by simply taking the Church of England as a national church and nominalizing it into a plurality of parishes. So they're not separatists, but they are autonomous. And this leads to this new strand of congregational autonomy, which is what it gets exported out to the New World. And it's interesting because precisely they still see themselves, they do not see the point that they are separatists. They continue to debate the liturgy even when they're in the New World. And you have people like John Ball arguing over them about whether it's possible to have a stinted liturgy or not. And what we have are a whole range of liturgical views in the New World, where you have even some Presbyterians there in Newbury and in Hingham, Massachusetts, where they still want to hold on to elements of the Book of Common Prayer, even among those Puritan migrants. Obviously, there's a big debate over extemporary prayer and wanting more leeway. And this is where the debate starts to continue to evolve. And this idea of wanting a purity of worship is certainly something that we see. I think, Heiko Oppermann said that the Reformed religion on the continent was a religion of refugees. And John Coffey, I think, beautifully wrote about how the Puritan Reformation was a reformation of refugees and exile in many ways, because they identified specifically with moments of exile in scriptures. And this goes all the way back under Queen Mary and beyond, when there's certain patterns in Israel's history of exile that the Puritans are latching onto. But what's important to note here is that it's not just simply in Egypt, and it's not just simply the Babylonian captivity. When they are in exile in Amsterdam or elsewhere, they're meeting rabbis who have over a millennia of tradition of exile, this sense of diaspora. And there are certain patterns in their religiosity that develop post-Second Temple, in the post-Second Temple, where they move away from the priest and from the temple to the law and the teaching and a direct intimacy with the divine. That gets woven into that Puritan experiment. So I just wanted to mention this idea that there is a longer story of exile, diaspora, refuge that is not just cherry-picked from certain biblical examples, but is in fact in conversation directly with other religious exiles and those who are they're meeting in Amsterdam and elsewhere. Which
Thank you.
means that this challenges the idea of this Anglo-American exceptionalism, that this is a story that of course the English see themselves in some ways in unique covenant, but it's not exclusionary.
Thank you so much. Now, I think we need to come to a conclusion. I think this is a good point. Thank you very much indeed, Polly, for that, as it were, theological insight. We need to think about how, for these founders of a tradition, the ability to receive those who were in refuge and the ability to be the church in refuge was an important part of who they were. Any concluding thoughts on that? Dermot?
You put it very well, and we've given lots of examples of that in the 16th century. If we had the time, we could go on into the mid-17th century, when those who began to think of themselves as Anglicans were again in exile, alongside the exiled king, the Stuart king, who became Charles II. Very much of what later Anglicans think of as Anglicanism was created by the experience of suffering and exile in the 1650s. And that was the mood in which the Book of Common Prayer of 1662 was created. So all these stages in the history of the Church of England, which became the basis for an Anglican worldwide communion, at all these stages for 150 years, exile, refugee status is absolutely essential to the story.
Mm.
I suppose my concluding thoughts would be that the Church of England's history is a long story of this engagement with the broader conversations, and that it was sharpened and enriched, and that theologically speaking, we see so much that develops out of that constant engagement,
Mhm.
not only in receiving, but then also traveling and bringing back. And so this sense in which even those who seem to be the most, kind of radical on the end of dissent are continuing to have this conversation. And it is, it takes us back to that Republic of Letters, but the church seen as united and continued to be connected as a body is what really continue to facilitate that. And in their own minds, they're not thinking, even when they're claiming a degree of autonomy, they're still in very much in communion with those, even across the Atlantic and across the North Sea.
Indeed, yes, yes. Refuge does not necessarily break the bounds of amity and the sense of siblinghood, as it were, between those different communities. Thank you both very much indeed. Looking at the time, I think we should probably conclude this recording, and I look forward very much to moving on to the next stage of the conversation. So I'll pause the recording now. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you. That's really very interesting. I love, so therefore, that all this you used the word layered composition, the Book of Common Prayer is layered, which is a very rich expression of how the prayer book was formed and developed. There's a there's an exile experience and all the ideology and spirituality of it, exile and refuge, actually have as I think you the word mediate and a compromise, I think is the word, so which actually produced this rich text that could not have been otherwise.
And I'll add one more note, because we didn't have the time to discuss this in the recording, which is that I think, far be it from me to disagree at all with what Diarmaid was mentioning about the very reformed, unmistakably reformed flavor of the Book of Common Prayer under Edward. But having said that, what I think is interesting is there's a sense in which we can be talking about Cranmer's views, we can be talking about what's in the liturgy, but then we can also be talking about other efforts, because even after the earliest version, you have Cranmer inviting Lutherans to speak with the Reformed in a Protestant synod. So even though the Church of England say we are Reformed in some of these teachings, we can still negotiate and be players that can mediate. And I think that is astonishing. And so even if one can hold to a confessional statement on a particular doctrinal tradition, that doesn't preclude doing exactly as Hooker does, which is saying that even beyond the Christian tradition, Jewish tradition, other traditions can actually enrich our own.
So I assume that the thesis you three are actually putting forth is that spirituality, which later I think becomes sort of spirituality or theology of via media, that which Hooker uses, but it is informed by the exile experience and is founded actually upon that. Would that be a correct way to put it? Is that a connection, you think?
Well, you threw
Am I
in a
pushing too
classic
much?
phrase, via media, which I have had some struggles with in the past, I'll be honest with you. The sense in which the phrase is used in I think it's the 1662 preface, put me right, Polly, if I'm wrong, is to say that the Church of England has always taken a middle way between too much change and too much stiffness in adhering to a set text. In other words, the moderation lies in saying there is something deeper just than the form of words, or indeed the form of doctrine. There is something about how we worship which can be worked with in a sort of conversational way that we've been discussing. And I think part of our thesis would be to say that the experience of conversation, of dialogue with people who travel to one and to whom one travels, has the effect of encouraging an awareness that one form may not be the only way in which a church should worship, even under an act of uniformity, that there may be room for thinking again about it from time to time.
And that's where Hooker is key, because he takes what was kind of a practical necessity and expediency, and he turns it into a spiritual good and says that there's an edification that can come from that stance. And so in defending that, he's adding to what, what the church, not just as a living being is, but what as a healthy growing being is. And I think that understanding of via media to me has always been one that can get perhaps decontextualized, and often it's used as in the way that I mentioned earlier, as kind of plotting the Church of England on these coordinates between the Reformed and the Catholic, and trying to find exactly where it stands, as opposed to thinking about many of these other dimensions, as you've both mentioned. And I think that in that sense, mediating is an interesting way to not speak of media, but to take a mediating and facilitating.
Like that.
Yeah.
Because Ethan Shagan has written about how everyone is claiming to be a moderate figure. Even the most extreme people are all calling themselves to be moderate. And that the language of moderacy, some people saw as actually being a regime when it's at most coercive, actually, because they were trying to silence dissent. So this idea of kind of using via media as just kind of simply a happy, cozy medium, I don't know if it quite does justice to the idea of what's going on in the kind of hard work of not just trying to find a middle ground, but actually bringing traditions together in a way that actually enriches and builds.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I think you've edified and the whole idea of via media for Euan just now, perhaps. Another question I have is the idea of the spirituality, if you will, of exile and being exile and refuge, that experience, which wasn't real life experience, lived experience for many of these reformers, that produced the Book of Common Prayer. And then is that translated to maybe the spirituality of maybe welcoming, hospitality, wideness, and all of that in the church polity, you think?
Well, one thing which I wondered if we might mention, but which we didn't in the end have time to mention in the conversation, was the fact that for all of the reign of Elizabeth and all of the reign of James and into the reign of Charles I, there are congregations worshipping in England which are made up of non-English people. They're the so-called stranger congregations. Now, I think, again, I'd be very interested in Polly's thoughts on this, because you know this area much better than I. But these stranger churches were not regarded necessarily as outside the Church of England, although they came from people who were part of a different tradition, perhaps worshipping in a different way. And the presence of these exile churches, French, Dutch, and so forth, was something that was clearly felt to be a sensitive point for the Church of England's identity, because when you get to the controversies of the 1630s, I think I'm right in saying the exile churches get shuffled off. and the church is no longer so welcoming to them. So there is that long period where there is an appreciation that it is somehow a part of the Church of England's mission to be hospitable, and to be hospitable to those who are in the church but not identical to the church, so to speak. Would you agree with that, Polly?
Absolutely. I think this stretches back all the way to Edward's reign, as we were counting all of the refugees that are flooding into England. And then we have a lot of movement that continues under Elizabeth. And there's an awareness that there is going to be doctrinal influences. So this is why when you read some of, the anxieties about Anabaptism under Edward, you think, what on earth? Are there lots of Anabaptists from the Netherlands flooding in? Probably far more, far fewer than was feared, right? When you read the documents, it's not as if you've got all these Anabaptists, but they were just aware that by opening up this hospitality, that there might be some of the radicalism that maybe was even too radical for the continent that could end up in East Anglia, for instance. And so you do have this range that probably does feed into some of the more progressive Puritan discontents. They're all concentrated, a lot of them, in East Anglia. And they probably were, rubbing shoulders with some of these continental figures who had taken refuge. And I think what's so fascinating is that we wouldn't have had Hooker and so many other elements in the Church of England had we not had that robust, lively discussion that took place not just between English people, but with these continental counterparts and with these stranger churches and with all of these other people in the mix. That is what produced the beauty of confessional construction, not only for the Church of England and in Anglican tradition later on, but also, for the Westminster Confession, for the Baptist confessions. It's in England, it's on English soil that you get the most long enduring ecclesiastical confessional statements precisely because of this mix. And each denomination sharpening the other's self-awareness of its own potential abuses of power. And sometimes when we lack that conversation across denominational traditions, we get blind spots again because we grow unfamiliar with what those worries were that people in the 16th and 17th centuries had a ready answer for, because they were engaging across those differences and across those lines and across the continent's borders, right? So I think that's absolutely a big part of how the foreign churches served as another point of reference, and even as one where people, English people walking in and out of their doors.
Great, thank you. There's one question here that is asking, what role did Erasmus and Thomas More have in the English Reformation? They sure did. Who wants to kind of crack at it?
Okay, well, I'll have a go. First of all, there is what Erasmus and Thomas More represent in intellectual and even spiritual terms, and there's the individual people, the human beings, and I think we need to talk about both of those things. There is a thing called Renaissance Christian humanism, and like everything in history ending in an ism, one needs to be very careful about it. But broadly speaking, there is basically there is an approach to late medieval Christianity that comes out of taking the classical, literary, and ethical, and indeed spiritual tradition and applying that to how we do church. Erasmus is associated with that, but he's not the only one to explore how it could be done. What it means basically is that rather than seeing the religious life as being a matter of checking off a series of ceremonial and liturgical performances, which might include joining a monastery or taking a particular vow or engaging in some very profound ascetic practice, it becomes more a question of how can one be a virtuous, generous, companionable human being. And friendship and companionship is enormously valued in the culture of Erasmus and Thomas More. It's one of the things that they write most about. And that combines itself with a belief that studying scripture in the original languages is a good and necessary thing to do. And I would say both the ethical and the scholarly have afterlives in both the Protestant world, the Reformed world, and in the Roman Catholic world. There's tremendous biblical scholarship influenced by classical humanism in the Catholic world and also in the Protestant world. It takes different forms because there are confessional statements which prescribe how you will use scripture, and they're different. But that scholarly tradition, which is associated with Erasmus and his friends, carries on. But
And
then
it
you've
continues to
got
be
the...
republished. I was just going to mention it, you know, Erasmus's paraphrases continue to be republished, very
Yep.
popular throughout the 16th century.
Yep, very important. And that's a literary text that's available in English. And Dermot has pointed out in his monograph on Edward VI, which Polly referred to in the recording, that Queen Elizabeth was to some degree shaped in the late Henrician, Catherine Parr, John Cheek, Roger Ascham kind of mode of intellectual spirituality, which is not necessarily deeply dogmatic, but is it's ethical, it's spiritual, it's prayerful. The elephant in the room, of course, is that Thomas More comes to have a profound detestation for Protestantism in the form in which he comes across it. He hates William Tyndale. He detests a lot of what the reformers are doing to worship. And in the end, of course, this is a separate issue, but he stakes and ultimately loses his life on the idea that the church is founded on Christ's commission to Peter, and therefore no sovereign secular king can become leader of the church. And if we're to believe the reports, he says that of after he has been convicted at his trial. And Thomas More, of course, is also a persecutor of heretics. He imprisons some in his own household. He participates in repression. So you have to say that there is a legacy from the humanist ideal which flows into the way that the Church of England is formed. But neither Erasmus nor Thomas More can, by any stretch of the imagination, be seen as people who would have appreciated or loved or respected the form that the Church of England assumed. I mean, there's much more to it than that. So
I'll add just a brief footnote to that, which is that you know, you're mentioning of Elizabeth's kind of Erasmianism makes sense of why the Zurich Reformation just chimed with her, because Zwingli was an Erasmian and you have that same intellectual kind of formation, as it were, in a way that, you know, other characters were not as explicitly maybe and as intensely formed around.
Yes, and the other thing to say, of course, is that all of this classicizing tradition helps to feed into the very distinctive Church of England passion for going back to the early church, for finding the earliest liturgical texts, for finding the earliest theological texts. That isn't unique to the English. You know, people like Bullinger and Zimmler in Zurich are doing, I think, rather similar things. But it certainly helps to shape the belief of the reformers that what they are doing is creating a church that is an authentic expression of the historic Christian church.
Let me just add one more comment here on Exile in the Church of England and Patrology, because John Jewell's Exile on the continent is where he is just hoovering up and swallowing whole as much patristic scholarship as he can. And so when he writes in defense of the Church of England at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign and kind of throws down his gauntlet challenge sermon to the Catholics and tries to reverse it and says, "Where was your church?" He is just sort of filling his pages with patristic references And that already starts to set a whole patristic tradition in the Church of England to the point where people are repeating his mistakes, embarrassingly. But John Jewel's importance here on in Exile, picking up this early church material, is not to be understated. It is incredibly significant for patristic scholarship in England.
Yes. And let's not pass by at this point the fact that John Jewel's Apology of the Church of England, a lot of Europeans will have read it in Latin, but the people in England who read it in English will have read it in the translation that was made by a learned lady, Anne Cook. And one of the most spectacular examples of a really important theological text that, in effect, became available to the Church of England through a learned woman.
So one questioner asked is, I would be curious to know whether how Anglicanism can and should commemorate the English Reformation, while the other Lutheranism do not do that. Like there's not like that. Do you have any thought on that? It's an interesting question.
How to commemorate the English Reformation. I was explaining to my colleagues why, unlike some of the Reformation movements on the continent, the English one poses a particular challenge because you can see it stretching on for over a century. So it is an unwieldy thing. And so that's why that question is tricky for me, because there's so many moments that it's hard to narrow it down to a single point. And I think that in some ways, that's kind of almost the point, is that they are kind of have this open-ended, when Hooker, I mean, maybe you could just kind of use the Hookerian moment as the watershed, as many historians have said, that this is an Anglican moment, the Shakespeare of Anglicanism, when Hooker basically argues for that very point, that there is a contextualization where this tradition is living within its context and will continue to live on, and an acknowledgement of a future along with the deep past is something that is a tremendous moment. So you could pick the 1590s, which has been known by some as the nasty 90s, but also out of that nastiness, some of the most incredible, insightful moments also coming alongside that, which I hope will give hope that often in the most brutal conflicts, there is a depth of insight that can come from deep historical reflection rather than mere reaction. And I think that is one of the lessons to be learned, that Hooker was forged in what was seen as the worst decade of Elizabeth's reign, but in some ways is a real moment for the English Reformation and the Anglican tradition. And it was in dire circumstances, with war abroad, war in the court, harvest failure, the poorest of the Tudor century, all of the political upheaval, everything, and even what contemporaries were calling a religious war with the Puritans. So there's, in every sense, the 1590s were the worst decade for the Tudors, materially and politically, and no succession, right? No Tudor succession. So there just seemed like no hope. And yet out of that was born a beautiful statement by Hooker about what it means to think deeply with tradition and to think about a long future.
Yeah. I think the challenge which many Anglicans will find about commemorating Anglicanism is that, yes, there are moments, and I think, Polly, you've been incredibly eloquent about what we can draw from Hooker, and I agree with you. The difficulty is that the difficulty, and also you might say the richness and the beauty of the Anglican tradition, is that everyone can find a particular moment that appeals to them, that speaks to them. Even the deeply controversial period in the 1630s, which almost destroys, and does for 15 years, disestablish the church. The ultimate result of the great diversification that happens in the 19th century between, as it were, the evangelical harking back and expressing a loyalty to the traditions of the Reformation, and then what becomes the Anglo-Catholic tradition saying it wasn't really part of the Reformation at all, it was a distinctive national tradition. Those two things ultimately meld and sort of coexist in a way that could never have been foreseen and could never have been planned. In other words, I think the tradition, the beauty of the tradition lies in the fact that it is greater than any one person could ever have imagined, and that it comes out of the Spirit working through a lot of people who maybe differ and see different things that they value and different things that are worthy of commemoration.
Thank you.
I see there's a few other questions in the Q&A.
Uh,
Do we want to try and do
yeah,
this, or are we out of time?
we're slightly out of time. We're a little over time, so I don't want to hold you
Yeah.
both too long.
Yeah.
I do want to address actually Kevin Maroney, who is a liturgical scholar. He talks about, so he was asking whether the first two books were really, there's a lot of Lutheran, litany come from the Lutheran period, Kramer. So is it calling it reformed document? Isn't that pushing it too much? Is it better to say that Eucharist in the first book were reformed documents rather than entire books? I don't know. What do you think?
I think we'd almost need Dermot here, and he's not able to to respond to that.
Diarmaid is the
I mean,
scholar on that.
one of the things that I sometimes try to persuade, not always successfully, my students and my colleagues of, is that the Reformation is visibly politically divided into these two traditions, the Reformed and the Lutheran. But there's also an awful lot that they agree on.
Mhm.
And both in terms of theology and worship, there are ways in which you can, they can talk to each other. And one of the more extraordinary things about the Reformation, I wrote a chapter for Dermot's Festschrift about who called each other heretics in the post-Reformation. And although these traditions were in many ways at odds with each other, you had to be very extreme to be a Lutheran who called the Reformed a heretic, or even more, a Reformed who called the Lutheran a heretic. The usual Reformed rhetoric was to say, the Lutherans are our siblings, they just haven't quite finished the job. That's the rhetoric which they adopted. Everyone said the Anabaptists were wrong, and some of them called them heretics. But the issue of identity, of how closely you can define a liturgical practice as being of this camp or of that camp, it looks clearer sometimes in hindsight than it did at the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's right to say that we can talk about reformed leanings and clarity on particular doctrinal positions, which is, I think, rightly pointed out. But that doesn't preclude, some hard and fast exclusion of this idea that they might be able to broker something with Melanchthon. I mean, the fact that Cranmer invites Melanchthon over along with Bullinger
He
for the
does.
Protestant Synod after the first version, and in the second version, he's still at it, trying to broker some kind of mediation. And that's why I was mentioning that in the recording, that there's a sense in which, yes, he might have particular views himself, but does that mean he doesn't see there being space for this engagement?
Right.
And as Euan was mentioned, I think there's a sense in which he thinks people will come along, maybe, and they all do, right? They're all still in talks. And so I think that's right to say that there's still a sense of fluidity and also layers of identity, all being Protestant and yet not agreeing on particulars, whether it come to ecclesiastical polity or other areas. And even with ecclesiastical polity, depending on your geographic region, you could have more superintendency or not, depending on how close you were to other Reformed communities. So even within the Lutheran and Reformed communities, there are variations ecclesiologically. And so it's not quite as rigid, even if you obviously have a consolidation over time.
Thank you. It just occurred to me, one of the things that you bring up, Polly, is the centrality of conversation in development of Book of Common Prayer. It's exile experiences, but it's actually also in conversation with various different ideas and people who come, who bring all different sorts of ideas, some contradicting, but they're in conversation all the time. And that actually produces Book of Common Prayer. And that actually is also seems to be the very important spirituality of the book.
And also, I'll say
Yeah.
that it's more than just a conversation. It's a very intense, high octane theological debate and exchange. They are really going at it, and there's a whole book to be written on theological insult because they had the best of them, and yet it improved their thinking because they deeply engaged with the discontents and people who disagreed the most violently, and that improved each of these traditions. That's usually in my teaching, I show how each tradition was enriched by its critics. And not just its critics. I mean, I think that the wonderful thing about the Book of Common Prayer, the first edition, is that, if you see this going out for peer review, you get the whole range. It's like an academic peer review today. You get two contradictory reports. You get Bootser saying minor, published with minor addition, revisions, and you get Gardner saying no. Don't bother. So that's good. You want different readers, you want different critics, and some who are perhaps more sympathetic than others. But it's certainly that exchange which enriched the Book of Common Prayer itself as well.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring us to a close, and I have a final question, which may back to a brief answer from each of you. Is that given the Book of Common Prayer spirituality that is informed, enriched by exile experience and this hot theological debate and conversation, what is your hope that for that kind of spirituality to continue to inform us in our life today, especially both not just in the church, but also in our secular society as well?
Wow. Yes, great question, and we don't have enough time to do justice to it, Bishop. But
Yeah, I know. But
as a priest, I feel I'm enormously grateful to be in a tradition which is defined more by its worshipping traditions than by its doctrinal traditions, and that we can be in conversation about our beliefs, and we can accept that our praying traditions, our worshipping traditions they go back a very, very long way. They are very ancient, and yet they are constantly being recreated and evolving. And that seems to me an appropriate way to respond to the Spirit in a time frame in which human culture and human life is constantly changing and evolving.
Wow. I'm not quite sure how to do justice to that question either, but I will try to reflect on at least two things very briefly, which is that history has a way, I think, sometimes of mending the soul, because we see a context, in hindsight, where it looks as if there is no hope. It's just dire, and the world is aflame. And yet being able, as a church historian, to look back at some of those most challenging, difficult moments and to see beautiful theological statements and reflections come out of the crucible of those is not just a nice pat way of trying to make it all better, but it is to show how redemptive the church can be even in the most dire of circumstances. And I think that gives hope, because we have again and again examples of this. I gave the example of Hooker, but you can just turn to so many where the circumstances under which the beautiful, the beautiful riches that we've inherited have come out of those difficult moments. And so I think it's a call to think deeply with history and moments, to give us that perspective of that keeps us from being just a prisoner of the present. And I think secondly, I would say that I truly appreciate at Divinity the enormous breadth and range of students and colleagues and people in the university that I daily encounter, and so enriched by myself. And so I find myself just so spoiled with riches of these kinds of conversations that show to me that they can still exist. You know, I can have students who disagree theologically, but who have incredibly wonderful insights that enrich the other. And I found that actually it's the mediating figures, you know, the Bootsers, these others who are still trying to hold things together when everything's falling apart, who are these heroes. You know, as I see students do this, as I see other facilitators who may not agree, but they're keeping us in conversation in a moment when all the algorithms are designed to inflame and to enrage. And the church, rightly, needs to have a holy, righteous anger in moments. And yet at the same time, if the church cannot be mediators trying to seek some kind of peace and discussion across the aisle, then what hope is there? So to me, I think that there is a lesson to be learned about how people could disagree theologically and still learn from each other. That's a virtue. When they had print, really kind of actually, and cheap print, starting to take cheap theological jabs and thin the debate out. But we saw even with the technology moving in that direction, there were still many who were committed to deep, genuine, sincere conversation and exchange.
Thank you so very much for this rich conversation, both of you, and Diarmaid as well. It's been just an amazing time. I'm so honored to be engaged with you in this conversation and to be in your presence. I am really privileged. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. It was a privilege to join you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you.
It's wonderful. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it, and hope that you join us for the next one on June 18th. We have the session on transgender spirituality and theology. Look for the link invitation for that. Okay. Bye.